Margaret Thornfield's voice cut through her Manhattan penthouse like a blade. It dripped with the kind of condescension that only comes from inherited wealth. "Come here, girl. How about showing us how they play violin in the projects?" 17-year-old Sophia Reyes was helping her mother serve appetizers at Mrs. Thornfield's charity gala. That's when the real estate heiress decided to make her the evening's entertainment. The other guests chuckled behind their crystal wine glasses. Wall Street executives, federal judges, their diamond-draped wives, all laughing at what was about to unfold. Margaret had organized this fundraiser for underprivileged youth in the arts, but she clearly hadn't expected to have one of them actually serving food in her $50 million penthouse. The irony was absolutely delicious to her. "I bet she can at least hold the bow correctly," Margaret continued. She gestured toward the violin displayed in her glass case like a museum piece. "It'll be amusing to see what this girl can do against someone who's actually studied with the masters." Federal Judge Harrison Webb whispered to his wife behind his champagne flute, "I bet she doesn't even know proper finger positioning. These people have no appreciation for classical technique." Laughter rippled through the room like waves across a lake of privilege. Sophia's mother, Elena, lowered her eyes. She tightened her grip on the silver serving tray. 22 years cleaning offices and penthouses, raising her daughter alone on a janitor's salary. And she still had to watch her employer use her child as a joke to impress wealthy friends. She had known Margaret since the woman was in college, had watched her transform from a spoiled sorority girl into a ruthless socialite over the decades. "Elena, you can stop serving for a few minutes," Margaret commanded with false sweetness. "I want you to watch your daughter play. It will be educational for both of you." Sophia remained perfectly still for several heartbeats. Her dark eyes analyzed not only the violin case, but every face in the room. At 17, she had already learned that silence often reveals more about people than 1,000 words. And at that moment, what she saw was a group of privileged adults who had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. There was something about Sophia's posture that made some of the guests stop laughing. A strange stillness, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Her fingers moved unconsciously, as if she were fingering invisible strings on an invisible instrument. "Of course, Mrs. Thornfield," Sophia replied with composure that made several guests exchange curious glances. "It would be my honor." Margaret smiled with satisfaction. She settled into her Italian leather armchair like a queen preparing to watch gladiators fight. "Excellent. I bet you've never played on an instrument like this, have you? Genuine French craftsmanship from 1847. Each component worth more than, well, you understand." Supreme Court Justice Patricia Chin sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. She commented aloud, "Margaret, are you certain this isn't cruel? The poor girl is going to be humiliated." "Nonsense," Margaret retorted, adjusting her emerald necklace. "It's a learning opportunity. She'll tell her friends she played a real violin in a real penthouse." What Margaret Thornfield didn't know was about to change everything. This project kid had spent the last 9 years mastering every technique, every composition, every nuance that the greatest violinist in history had ever developed. While her classmates played video games, Sophia devoured sheet music borrowed from the public library. She watched legendary performances on the cracked tablet she had managed to repair herself. In the silent hours before dawn, when Elena worked double shifts cleaning office buildings, Sophia practiced scales on a $50 violin from a pawn shop. She analyzed the techniques of Heifetz, Perlman, Hilary Hahn. She had memorized more than 300 classical pieces, could perform the 75 most challenging violin compositions by heart. But most importantly, Margaret had no idea that she was about to be humiliated by the same girl she had underestimated out of pure prejudice in front of all her powerful friends. And when the truth emerged, it wouldn't just be a musical defeat. It would be a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. While Margaret retrieved the violin from its case with theatrical flourishes, Sophia observed each guest. Something in her eyes suggested she wasn't just preparing for a performance. She was preparing to rewrite every assumption in that room about who truly deserved respect. If this story of prejudice and extraordinary talent has moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what happened next proved that judging someone by their circumstances can be the most expensive mistake a person makes in their entire life. Margaret took her position near the grand piano with the confidence of someone who had never lost anything important in her life. "I always choose the piece, dear. It's a house tradition," she announced. She completely ignored the fact that in serious musical performances, the artist typically selects their own repertoire. Sophia nodded silently and accepted the violin with reverence that made Judge Webb frown. The instrument was positioned against her shoulder with precision that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with a professional-grade violin. Her bow grip was textbook perfect, her posture flawless. "Let's make this interesting," Margaret announced to her guests. "If the girl manages to play even one movement without embarrassing herself, I'll donate $5,000 to some public school music program." Laughter echoed through the penthouse again. But this time Sophia looked up and smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that smile. It was the same expression Sophia had worn as a child whenever someone underestimated her in school talent shows. The same smile she displayed at 13 when she announced she no longer needed help with her music theory homework. "Let's start with something simple," Margaret declared condescendingly. "How about Twinkle Twinkle Little Star? That should be manageable for someone of your background." The suggestion drew snickers from the audience. But Sophia simply nodded graciously. "Actually," she said quietly, "would you mind if I played Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor? The Chaconne movement?" An uncomfortable silence filled the room. That wasn't the request of someone who might know how to hold a violin properly. The Chaconne was considered one of the most technically demanding pieces in the entire violin repertoire, a composition that separated amateur players from true virtuosos. "Interesting choice," murmured Justice Chen, leaning forward with sudden attention. Margaret hesitated for several seconds. Long enough for Sophia to realize that the woman had probably heard the piece performed at galas but had no understanding of its technical complexity. "Well, if you insist on attempting something so advanced." While Margaret processed this unexpected development, Sophia allowed herself a brief journey into memory. 9 years earlier, when she was only 8 years old, she had discovered a damaged violin in a dumpster behind a music store. She had carried it home hidden in her backpack and begged Elena to let her keep it. "Mija, why do you want that broken thing?" her mother had asked, exhausted after a 16-hour shift cleaning office buildings. "To be like the musicians on TV, Mama. They always say poor kids can't make beautiful music." At that time, Elena earned barely $800 a month. There was no money for lessons, for sheet music, for anything beyond basic survival. But there was the public library, which became Sophia's conservatory. Every day after school, she walked 4 miles to study classical compositions in worn books that no one else touched. Margaret finally gestured impatiently toward the violin. "Well, go ahead then. Let's see what you can do with a real instrument." Sophia raised the violin to her shoulder. Something fundamental shifted in the room's atmosphere. Her first note rang out with such clarity and precision that several guests stopped their conversations mid-sentence. A single, pure D. It wasn't just the sound of someone who could play. It was the sound of someone who understood music at a molecular level. The opening measures of the chaconne flowed from the violin like liquid gold. Each note was placed with surgical precision, each phrase shaped with an emotional intelligence that transformed the penthouse into a concert hall. Margaret's confident smile began to falter as she realized this wasn't a child struggling with an advanced piece. This was a masterclass in violin performance happening in her living room. Judge Webb, who had studied violin at Juilliard 40 years earlier, recognized immediately what he was witnessing. "Margaret," he whispered urgently, "this girl isn't just talented, she's extraordinary." But Margaret was too invested in proving her superiority to acknowledge what was becoming obvious to everyone else in the room. "She must have memorized this specific piece," she muttered. "Probably watched it on YouTube." That's when Sophia did something that made the hair on every musician's arm stand up. Without breaking her performance, she seamlessly transitioned into her own improvised variations on Bach's theme. Variations that demonstrated not just technical mastery, but creative genius that couldn't be learned from any video or lesson. The room fell completely silent, except for the soaring melody that seemed to transform the very air around them. Sophia's fingers danced across the strings with impossible speed and precision. Her bow created dynamics that ranged from whisper-soft to thunderous. Elena watched from the corner, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and terror. She knew Sophia was gifted, but she had never heard her daughter play with this level of intensity and sophistication. For the first time in 22 years of working in that penthouse, she saw something she had never witnessed before. Genuine awe in Margaret Thornfield's eyes. Each phrase Sophia played seemed to strip away another layer of the guests' preconceptions. This wasn't just music. It was a revelation, a systematic dismantling of every assumption they had made about talent, class, and worth. What those privileged people didn't understand was that every note of contempt they had expressed was being answered by something they couldn't buy, couldn't inherit, couldn't fake. Pure, undeniable genius forged in adversity and refined through years of solitary dedication. The chaconne built toward its climactic passages. Sophia's performance transcended mere technical execution. She was telling a story, the story of struggle, of dreams deferred but never abandoned, of beauty emerging from the most unlikely circumstances. As the final notes faded into silence, the penthouse remained absolutely still for what felt like an eternity. Sophia lowered the violin slowly, her breathing steady, her expression calm. Margaret stared at her with an expression that cycled through disbelief, embarrassment, and something approaching fear. For the first time in her privileged life, she had encountered something that made her wealth, her connections, and her social status completely irrelevant. That was... Justice Chen began, then stopped, apparently unable to find adequate words. Judge Webb stood up slowly, his face pale. "Margaret, do you understand what just happened here? That girl just performed one of the most challenging pieces in classical music with an interpretation that would be remarkable coming from a conservatory graduate." Sophia remained standing quietly, still holding the violin with the same reverence she had shown from the beginning. But now something had completely changed in the room's dynamics. The guests no longer looked at her as entertainment. They looked at her as someone who had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. And they looked at Margaret with a mixture of embarrassment and disappointment that she had never experienced in her entire life. What Margaret Thornfield didn't realize yet was that this musical revelation would be only the opening movement in a much larger composition. One where all the social harmonies she had always taken for granted would be questioned, and where the girl she had underestimated would prove that true artistry has nothing to do with pedigree or bank accounts. Margaret stared at Sophia for 15 seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the piano as if it could somehow anchor her to a reality that made sense. "That was just memorization," she stammered, her voice lacking all its previous authority. She must have practiced that one piece obsessively. Anyone can memorize a single song. Judge Webb walked closer to the violin, his expression grave. "Margaret, that girl just performed variations that I've never heard before. She was improvising. You can't memorize improvisation." Justice Chen pulled out her phone and began recording discreetly. As an experienced legal mind, she immediately recognized the historical significance of this moment. a racist millionaire being systematically dismantled by a prodigy she had underestimated for all the wrong reasons. "I don't accept this," Margaret declared, standing abruptly and nearly knocking over a $3,000 crystal vase. "Something's wrong here. No one learns to play like that without formal training. Someone coached her specifically to humiliate me." Sophia remained perfectly composed, still cradling the violin with professional care. "Would you like me to play something else? I know about 300 pieces by memory. Or I could sight read anything you have in your music collection." The offer sent a ripple of nervous energy through the guests. It was a challenge that sounded impossible, but after what they had just witnessed, no one dared doubt her capabilities. "You're being arrogant now," Margaret snapped, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "A girl from the projects doesn't speak to her betters with such presumption." That's when Elena stepped forward. For the first time in 22 years, she looked Margaret Thornfield directly in the eye without lowering her gaze. "Mrs. Thornfield," Elena said, her voice steady and clear, "my daughter is not from the projects. We live in a working-class neighborhood, and she is not being arrogant. She is being honest about abilities that you clearly cannot recognize or appreciate." The tension in the penthouse escalated exponentially. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple musical performance. Margaret whirled toward Elena with fury blazing in her eyes. "How dare you speak to me that way? Have you forgotten your place in this household?" "No," Elena replied with quiet dignity. "I've remembered my worth." Judge Webb intervened, clearly disturbed by the direction of the confrontation. "Margaret, perhaps we should acknowledge that the young lady possesses genuine talent and—" "Talent?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Don't you understand? This was orchestrated. Someone trained her specifically to make me look foolish in my own home." Sophia finally stood up. When she spoke, her voice carried a maturity that silenced every adult in the room. "Mrs. Thornfield, would you like to know the truth? I wasn't trained to humiliate you. I spent the last 9 years studying violin because I dreamed of playing for people who respected music. People who understood that artistry has no color, no social class, no zip code." She paused, looking at each person present with steady confidence. "When you asked me to show you how they play violin in the projects, I thought I would finally have a chance to demonstrate that I deserve respect. But now I understand that you never wanted to hear real music. You wanted a performance of inferiority." Justice Chen had stopped recording and was watching the scene with fascination. "How old are you, dear?" 17, Sophia replied. "And how long have you been playing seriously?" 9 years, ma'am." Chen looked at Margaret with an expression that mixed disbelief and professional disapproval. "Margaret, you've just been outperformed by a self-taught teenager, a teenager whose family you employ, a teenager you invited to play as entertainment." Margaret felt the weight of every gaze in the penthouse. For the first time in her privileged life, they were not looks of admiration or envy. They were looks of judgment. "I didn't know she played at that level." She attempted to defend herself, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "The question isn't whether she played at that level," Judge Webb said, his tone sharp with disapproval. "The question is why you assumed she couldn't. Was it because she's your employee's daughter? Because she's Latina? Because she doesn't have money?" The silence that followed was absolutely devastating. Sophia carefully placed the violin back in its case, each movement executed with the same precision she had shown throughout the evening. "Thank you for allowing me to play your violin, Mrs. Thornfield. It was educational." When she finished, she turned to her mother. "Mama, can we go? I have school tomorrow and I want to practice before bed." Elena nodded, removing the apron she had worn to serve the guests. But before leaving, she turned to Margaret one final time. "Mrs. Thornfield, thank you for showing me that my daughter belongs in much better places than this." As mother and daughter walked toward the elevator, Justice Chen called out, "Sophia, are you interested in scholarships? I know several conservatories that would be honored to have someone with your talent." Sophia stopped and smiled, her first genuine smile of the entire evening. "Very interested, ma'am." Chen handed her a business card. "Call me Monday morning." Margaret watched, motionless, still processing how she had lost complete control of the situation in less than 2 hours. She had gone from respected hostess to the woman who had underestimated a virtuoso out of pure prejudice, in front of the most important witnesses in her social circle. When the elevator doors closed behind Sophia and Elena, the remaining guests looked at each other in uncomfortable silence. Judge Webb was the first to move toward the door. "I think I should leave as well." One by one, the guests began departing, offering only cold farewells and disapproving glances. Margaret was left alone in her penthouse, still staring at the violin case where her arrogance had been systematically destroyed by a teenager she had considered beneath her notice. But what she didn't know was that tonight would be just the opening movement in a much larger symphony. One where Sophia Reyes would rewrite not only her own destiny, but challenge the entire system of privilege that people like Margaret Thornfield took for granted. As Sophia walked through the marble lobby of the Manhattan high-rise with her mother, she carried in her pocket the business card that would change her life forever. And in her mind, she was already composing, not just musical pieces, but movements in a much grander composition. The symphony of proving that true nobility cannot be purchased with money, but must be earned through character. 6 months later, Sophia Reyes walked through the hallways of the Juilliard School with a full scholarship to study violin performance. Justice Chen had kept her promise. She connected Sophia not only with academic opportunities, but with an entire network of people who recognized genius regardless of social background. The video of that night in Manhattan had gone viral. 4.2 million views in 3 weeks. Not because someone had secretly recorded the performance, but because Justice Chen herself had shared the story on her social media platforms. She transformed Sophia into a symbol of triumph over prejudice and Margaret into a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption. "Teenage violin prodigy destroys prejudiced millionaire's assumptions" was the headline that circulated across every major news platform. The comments were relentless. "What a disgrace for that woman, and this girl deserves every opportunity in the world," dominated the response sections. Margaret Thornfield had become persona non grata in her own social circles. The Metropolitan Opera removed her from their board of directors after pressure from other patrons. 3 major charities declined her donations. Even Judge Webb, her friend of 2 decades, began avoiding her at social gatherings. "Margaret has always been elitist, but I never imagined she could be so publicly cruel," Webb's wife commented during a dinner in the Hamptons. "To humiliate a child like that in front of everyone, it's unconscionable." The most painful part for Margaret was realizing that Sophia had never sought revenge or exposure. She'd simply played violin, something she did naturally, with a mastery developed through years of quiet dedication. The humiliation Margaret felt was entirely self-inflicted, a direct consequence of her own prejudiced assumptions. Elena had been promoted to facilities manager at a prestigious Manhattan hotel, a position that paid 4 times her previous salary and included full benefits for both her and Sophia. It wasn't charity. It was recognition of the professionalism and integrity she had always demonstrated, now finally valued by employers who looked beyond prejudice. Sophia founded a free online music program that connected young people from underserved communities with conservatory mentors. In less than 8 months, 2,400 children were learning not just how to read music, but life principles that no traditional classroom could teach. "Music taught me that every person has a unique voice worth hearing," Sophia explained during an interview with 60 Minutes. "Mrs. Thornfield taught me that some people need to lose everything to learn what really matters." When asked if she held any resentment toward the woman who had tried to humiliate her, Sophia smiled with the same composure she had shown on that transformative night. Resentment is like playing out of tune. It only creates discord. I prefer to focus on the harmony I can create. Margaret watched that interview alone in her penthouse, now empty of the friends who had abandoned her after witnessing her cruelty. For the first time, she truly understood what she had lost that night. Not just a musical competition, but the opportunity to be a better human being. Judge Webb called once after the incident, just to say, "Margaret, you created that entire situation." Sophia responded with a grace you should have shown from the beginning. The lesson resonated far beyond Manhattan. Sophia proved that true artistry doesn't come from pedigree or privilege, but from passion refined through perseverance and demonstrated through performance. She transformed prejudice into purpose, others' limitations into her own liberation. Today, when Sophia looks toward the future, she sees no boundaries imposed by others' expectations, only infinite possibilities created by her own determination. Margaret had tried to diminish her to feel superior, but she ended up revealing that true greatness is measured by the ability to elevate others, not tear them down. Elena proudly displays a photograph of Sophia performing at Carnegie Hall on her living room wall. Next to it hangs a certificate from the music program that has already impacted thousands of young musicians, achievements that no amount of money could purchase and no prejudice could steal. The most beautiful revenge, as Sophia discovered, is not to destroy those who try to diminish you. It's to create something so extraordinary that their mediocrity becomes irrelevant by comparison. Margaret Thornfield tried to make her entertainment, but Sophia Reyes became inspiration, and that difference defines not only who succeeds in music, but who succeeds in life. But the story doesn't end there. 2 years later, Sophia Reyes stood on the stage of Lincoln Center preparing for her debut performance with the New York Philharmonic. In the audience sat Justice Chin, Judge Webb, and dozens of other influential figures who had witnessed her transformation from underestimated teenager to celebrated artist. Also in the audience, in a seat she had purchased anonymously, sat Margaret Thornfield. She had come not to gloat or to seek forgiveness, but to finally hear what she had been too prejudiced to appreciate that night in her penthouse. As Sophia raised her violin, and the first notes of Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto filled the concert hall, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before. Genuine humility. The performance was transcendent. Sophia didn't just play the music. She channeled every struggle, every doubt, every moment of triumph into a sonic tapestry that left the audience breathless. When the final note faded and the applause erupted, Margaret found herself crying for the first time in decades. After the performance, Margaret approached Elena in the lobby. "I owe you and your daughter an apology that I can never adequately express," she said quietly. "I was wrong about everything." Elena looked at her for a long moment, then nodded with the same dignity she had shown that night 2 years earlier. Sophia would say that mistakes are just practice for getting it right next time. Margaret smiled through her tears. She's wiser than I ever was. That night, Margaret Thornfield made the largest donation in her family's history to Sophia's music education program. Not for recognition or tax benefits, but because she had finally learned what Sophia had tried to teach her from the beginning. That true worth cannot be measured by circumstances, but only by character. Sophia's program now operates in 47 states and 12 countries, providing free music education to over 50,000 young people annually. Each student learns not just technique and theory, but the most important lesson of all, that talent, dedication, and character can overcome any obstacle that prejudice tries to place in their path. The violin that Sophia played that night in Margaret's penthouse now sits in the Smithsonian Institution, donated by Margaret herself with a plaque that reads, "In honor of Sophia Reyes, who taught us that genius recognizes no boundaries except those we impose upon ourselves." And every time a young person from an underserved community picks up an instrument for the first time through Sophia's program, they're not just learning to make music, they're learning to make history. Because sometimes the most beautiful symphonies begin with a single note of courage, played by someone the world underestimated, in a room full of people who thought they knew better. Sophia Reyes proved that they didn't. And in doing so, she composed a masterpiece that will inspire generations long after the last note has faded into silence. 5 years after that transformative night in Manhattan, the impact of Sophia's story continued to reverberate through countless lives. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a neurosurgeon from Detroit, credited Sophia's viral video with inspiring him to establish a scholarship fund for medical students from underrepresented communities. If a 17-year-old girl could overcome that level of prejudice with such grace, he said, then I had no excuse not to use my success to lift others up. The Sophia Standard became a term used in diversity and inclusion training programs across Fortune 500 companies. A reminder that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity does not. And that assumptions based on background can cause organizations to overlook their greatest potential assets. Margaret Thornfield, now in her 70s, spent her remaining years as a vocal advocate for arts education in underserved communities. She never sought public recognition for her transformation, but those who knew her story understood that witnessing true greatness had fundamentally changed her understanding of human worth. Elena Reyes became the director of hospitality services for a major hotel chain, overseeing operations across the Northeast. Her success wasn't just personal. She made it her mission to hire and promote employees based on merit and character rather than connections or background, creating opportunities for hundreds of working-class families. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the thousands of young people who saw Sophia's story and realized that their circumstances didn't define their potential. Letters poured in from around the world. From a young pianist in rural Alabama who earned a scholarship to Berklee College of Music, from a violinist in inner-city Chicago who now plays with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, from a cellist in East Los Angeles who founded her own music therapy program for children with disabilities. Each of these stories began the same way, with someone who refused to accept that their zip code, their family's income, or society's expectations could limit their dreams. Sophia's story became more than viral content. It became a movement. A reminder that in a world quick to judge and slow to listen, the most extraordinary gifts often come wrapped in the most ordinary circumstances. And every time someone chooses to look beyond surface assumptions to recognize the potential in another human being, Sophia's legacy grows a little stronger. Because the most powerful music isn't played on instruments. It's played on heartstrings, changing not just individual lives, but the entire composition of what we believe is possible. Sophia Reyes didn't just master the violin that night in Margaret Thornfield's penthouse. She mastered the art of transforming prejudice into purpose, obstacles into opportunities, and doubt into determination. And in doing so, she proved that the most beautiful music of all is the sound of someone refusing to be silenced by the world's limitations. The symphony continues, and it's more beautiful than anyone ever imagined it could be. If this story of triumph over prejudice and the power of recognizing hidden talent has inspired you, subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who needs to remember that greatness comes in all forms, from all places, and that our job is not to judge potential, but to nurture it wherever we find it. Because somewhere right now, there's another Sophia waiting for someone to listen to their music instead of their circumstances. And that someone could be you.